This is the Know Your Place podcast, episode 10. I'm Charles Altendorf. On this week's episode, I talk about on the ground versus centralized sourced for journalism, and sort of what I think good and bad journalism is. Anyway, stay tuned. Alright everyone, we're back here on the Know Your Place podcast, and this week we're talking about journalism, but not just journalism. We're talking about the sort of on-the-ground versus centralized point journalism. So, this has really been something that's been eating at me for a while now because of, sort of the YouTube journalism that's popped up, or the, sort of videos from the grounds kind of stuff that happens in the 2016 election as well. So, I see, you may ask me, why does a geographer care about journalism? Well, geography means to write about the Earth, and current events are the most important thing about the Earth, in some ways, right? So when I was in college, while we did have textbooks, a lot of the sources we used for our writings and our class discussions were just local news that was happening. Like in urban planning class, you would talk about urban developments and if they're working or not. Or in I mainly did urban geography, but you could also talk about environmental geography. You can talk about what's happening with pollution in an area and what it's caused, or migration came up a lot, immigration, that's part of geography as well. So we talk about these things, right? But as geographers, it's important for us to know what the best source of news is. And that's why I want to sort of talk about this overarching issue of on-the-ground reporting versus sort of having a centralized source that it emanates out of. Now, the reason why I say this is because, it was apparent during the 2016 election, and CNN and the New York Times admitted this afterward, that they didn't cover the Midwest, right? They didn't know what was happening in the Midwest of the United States. And we have to ask ourselves, is that in the inevitable point that all centralized news reaches? Does it come a point when it becomes so philosophical and ideological it doesn't even bother to send people out to places to report on things? Or now that, all the traditional news sites are losing money, even cable and newspaper, does that mean they just can't afford to send anybody out there anymore? I don't know, but, it appears that the central main pillars of the news, if you will, don't have a pulse on things. It feels, a lot of people feel disconnected from them. And a lot of people tell me they even, I saw a lot of people told me they trust the BBC's reporting on things, and I generally do trust it on things. I'll have to say I find it very accurate over the long haul. But you could argue they didn't cover a lot of things. They don't cover a lot of domestic things very accurately. They cover them very slanted, right? So, but then we have to remember that centralized bias is that more or less worse than the on-the-ground report bias, right? Because when somebody just records something with a camera, yeah, sure, and they just upload it without any commentary, maybe, just maybe, that's not slanted journalism. But you don't know what their agenda was. They could have just found the three crazy people doing something and recorded them and said, this is what's going on in my town. Look at my town. It's going totally to crap, right? And, and then in some of the more extreme cases, like InfoWars and Owen Schroyer, they're coming out and being openly hostile to the audience that's there. So I don't know. I don't know what's good there. It seems like that's a little far. And then I sort of like investigative documentaries like Frontline, but they clearly have shown over a few years that they also sometimes have a bias, or they don't seem to go after people they could go after, right? And I'm also a big fan of Nick Broomfield, and I don't think he really has much of a bias, fortunately. But he to even get the kind of level of journalism he's gotten, he had to like basically embed himself in these places and record for months, and then eventually he would get that golden moment where he, just by talking to these people for a long time, would allow them to hang themselves on their own words. And some people say that's somewhat unethical, because like, was he being their friend just to get it out of them, or did he generally like these people? I happen to think he formed some kind of camaraderie with them and did generally like those people, but you don't know, and you can tell that some of them are really put off by journalists, and when the BBC does hard talk too, you can see that sometimes these foreign countries are very put off by journalists, right? And I don't know what I value, because we've also seen the dark side of this instant upload culture, right? Sometimes videos get posted and they condemn people, and then we find out that, it was obviously a very slanted posting. Or sometimes they just post things I don't want to see the video of. Like, I don't like seeing videos of mass shootings or videos of real disgusting things, and people post them and then they come up there and then they get on the news. And then sort of taking it to the next extreme, because of whatever reason with these centralized places that don't have the money they used to, I guess, or the sort of, I don't know, do they lose skills in journalism or something? But these centralized places now often just look for these videos and repost them and bring on 2 or 3 commentators and talk about them. And I mean, I guess that's news, but is it really news? And, especially you get a case like, sometimes I've seen on even the Young Turks, they'll comment on a video of something that was posted, and they won't even show the video. So how do you really know what they're talking about? You don't know. You don't know if it even exists. You don't know if they made up what that video says. And you have to go try and find the source and find who it really was talking about, and that puts a lot of onus on you, the consumer of the news, right? Because here you have to go out there and then do all this exploratory research and figure out if that's really what happened. And I think it's even starting to trickle down to like the local news level. I follow this one website that's supposed to be local to Indianapolis, and I constantly see them reposting what we would call clickbait from places that aren't Indianapolis. And I don't know, I mean, obviously everybody should have like national news, I guess, on their site somewhere. But, they're reposting the most clickbaity stuff, like, you'll never believe what this teacher did. She slept with a student. I mean, it's like, is this really news? Why are you guys covering this? Can't you go find something down the street to cover? Like, is it a slow day at the news desk? How many people work at your news desk? So I don't know. And then once we sort of branch into that, then we reach an even bigger question, right? Is how do you fund news, right? There's a famous movie I want my entire listenership to watch called The Network. It's from 1976. But they talk about news as being something that's totally unprofitable. And they were talking about this in the 70s. So they really predicted the future on that one. As, I'm sure most of my audience knows that cable news and newspapers and everything is totally going belly up. But it's like, so you have to monetize it somehow. But then if you allow it to become monetized, right, and you allow people to pay for news, then does it inherently become biased? Because you're only going to do what your fans pay for you to do. The sort of gatekeeping aspect disappears then, right? Like if you're a right-leaning commentator and everybody comes and donates money to you, then you're only going to make right-leaning shows, and then if you're left-wing, you're only going to make left-wing shows. But then we can also go even deeper into this subject and go into even murkier waters. let's say you weren't actually there, so you can't record what actually happened there, but let's say you go back and you record all the people that were there during the time. Are they remembering everything that happened correctly? Or do some of those people have an axe to grind? Like I saw, a documentary about Jonestown. Okay, and yeah, the people they interviewed probably do remember what happened correctly, right? But you could tell when you listen to their voices, they were still trying to sort of whitewash what happened there. Because it's too painful for them to admit that they were involved in that, right? It's too painful for them to admit that they got caught up in this crazy cult-like behavior, right? And I also listened to a BBC documentary that they did about I watched one that they did about the Balkans, right? And they go back and they interview all these different generals from the Balkans, and all of them are totally biased, and you have to sort of watch all the sides and then make up your own mind about what you think was morally right. And at the end of the day, you kind of think, I don't know who was, right? So you go in there and you watch them and you're confused, right? And I guess that's sort of what I'm hitting at. How do I get rid of the confusion here? What do I trust? What do I point toward and say, that's the gospel, that's the right done stuff? Well, I guess I'll have to end this podcast by laying that out for you, the fans, what I think is good journalism. Okay? And I think it does involve somewhat of a mix, but I do think the on-the-ground aspect is important, okay? But you have to have somebody doing it who is like a Nick Broomfield, who does it over a long period of time and seems unbiased, or somebody who just has no axe to grind in the situation, and that's very hard. And I think we should spend more time in our society rewarding the journalists who don't become activists, who don't get too caught up into what they're reporting on. I know that sounds like backwards from the way we are now, but I really respect someone who can. Louis Theroux's another one I really respect, and in one of his documentaries, he says, "Oh yeah, I became best friends with these people, but deep down I knew I hated them," right? And that is some grade A stuff right there. Not many people can do that, and I think that's something that should be admired. Although I guess that makes them also somewhat like a double agent. But someone who's gonna screw these people later. I don't know. So yeah, that's my first step. So it's somebody who, and how can you tell if they have an axe to grind on the subject? Well, you can tell when they just if they're just getting super passionate in it, if they just seem totally caught up with let's say they were out interviewing some guerrillas, right? And they're just oh, look at these guerrilla fighters. The government is all at the wrong. It's hassling them. Well, that's probably not 100% true. There's probably two sides to this angle. So I guess what I'm trying to say is you can tell it's unbiased if they also report the shortcomings of the main subject matter. So in Nick Broomfield's one where he did a documentary about Kurt Cobain and Courtney Love, he when he interviews Courtney Love's father, he's Courtney Love's father was trying to blame her for Kurt Cobain's death, saying she basically orchestrated his murder. And Nick Broomfield, who by the end of the documentary has no love lost for Courtney Love because she basically got his funding yanked. He takes Courtney Love's father to task. He says, "How can you say this? Isn't this your daughter?" Right? And that when he says that in that moment, you're like, "Oh yeah, this is kind of weird. This is kind of messed up." So by the end of the documentary, you're kind of like, "I don't know. Did you can't decide if you're kind of convinced that maybe some of this stuff is just wild conspiracy that she murdered Kurt Cobain, but by the same token, you can't seem to think that Kurt Cobain actually wanted to kill himself, because he also talks about a lot of different scenes where Kurt Cobain's very loving for his daughter and wants to be her father. So it's that is really a gripping documentary. It's called Kurt and Courtney. You should watch it. You should watch all of Nick Broomfield's work. But that's where I think the crux of it is that. And another thing I would say is you can tell journalism is good if it's sort of, if the outlet is reporting about something that kind of damages its preconceived worldview. So like when the New York Times, let's not use the New York Times as let's say the New York Times were to come out and report something that's very scathingly wrong in New York City. Well, you can bet then that it's something that's kind of bad, like it's really happening. That it's like gotten so bad that the news outlet in the city can't ignore what's going on there anymore, that they have to report on it, that everyone deserves to know. Now, some people say, well, then isn't it too late? Like, does that mean that it should have been reported on sooner, or somebody should have trusted someone sooner? And yeah, it does mean that to a degree, but what can we do, right? I mean, should we just trust everyone that comes out of the woodwork? I don't know. I mean, I would love to. As everybody knows, I love a good conspiracy. Okay, I love a good conspiracy. But at the end of the day, until something gets light shed on it to the point that it can't be ignored anymore, it is kind of speculation. It's just kind of, it's like with sort of Al Franken or something, with what came out with him and his affair, or in his groping thing, Once there was finally proof that there was photographic evidence, notice both right and left-leaning outlets were no longer trying to pretend like it didn't happen, right? Because there was photographic evidence, and, you couldn't shield that anymore. So, it's sad. But I think it's important to realize we are in a clickbait society and culture, and sometimes we need to take a step back and wait for something to become universal news. But not universal in the news that's convenient for an agenda, but universal news is something that just can't be ignored anymore. So yeah, that's what I think the best guide is. And if you kind of wait and go through your life that way, I think you'll be less caught up in the 24/7 news cycle, and you'll be a happier person in general. Mass credit to people who do cutting edge stuff in the field. That's very important. But buyer beware. There's going to be bias sometimes. And look for people who generally look like they're not trying to be biased. Really, journalists who just seem like they don't have a preconceived opinion, who are more just observers. They're more just giving you a window into the world. And that's what I try to do as a geographer and on this podcast. I'm not saying that I don't have my biases, I guess I do, but I really try and give you just a view of the world as I see it. And I guess it's working out pretty well. Let me know in the comments. Anyway, thank you all. Check out the Know Your Place podcast on SoundCloud at soundcloud.com/knowyourplacepodcast, all one word, or on Facebook at facebook.com/knowyourplacepodcast, all one word. And we will be coming soon to YouTube and iTunes, and maybe another social media platform near you. Special thanks to my wife, Sarah, and Jay Graff for the riff.